Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we're going to share Skinwalker horror stories. First story. Skinwalkers of Michigan. We went back. So a few years ago, I posted a story here titled Michigan Skinwalkers. I'm here to tell you guys, I revisited the state forest. Now, I guess originally I added to many details in the original posting because I was trying to recall everything about what had happened. I tend to write down everything I'm thinking, so more details were added than what was needed for the story. So for this one, I'll keep pre-story short and sweet for you guys who just want to know the action. I guess a gear check would be the best starting point here. After my original encounter in 2013, since then myself and my two friends who came with this time have added some weapons to our arsenal. I guess I'll start my weapons. SAR K-9. Basically a CZ copy 9mm handgun. Takes 15 bullets to a magazine. Sweet little pistol, cheap for its quality. Next up was my brand new Oracle AR, 1555.6 in TE chamber, semi-automatic. It's an AR, nothing special. Again, for the sake of the story again, Eric and Justin make a return. Eric brought his S&W MMP Shield .45, coupled with a Remington Bolt Action 30.06. He's a bit of an overkill guy. Whatever, a gun's a gun. We're going to revisit some freaky shit. I don't blame him. Lastly, Justin. He brought a Glock 19 taking 9mm Luger and an AK-47 that he bought because he went full /K/Omando after our first experience. We all know what AK variants fire, but in case anyone doesn't play Call of Duty or Battlefield, they take 7.62 rounds. Camping gear again consists of a simple family-sized tent, a cooler, extra ammunition, and a much more robust kerosene grill, because we still wanted to at least enjoy the trip during the day. The car we took changed as I traded in the beater for a new one, but no one cares on with the story. Now I'll reiterate. These are the same woods we camped in close to 5 years ago at the time, and we're camping within 5 miles of where we thought we were the first time, where we had seen what we thought were skinwalkers the first time. Needless to say, we were freaking out on the drive up, but you know how people are. See some weird shit you can't explain, go scare that fucker out a second time, so you can promptly vacate your bowls a second time. The first day and night were pretty uneventful. We had our tent set up, roasted some patty for a local grocery store before it went bad, because coolers aren't great. Drank some light craft beers. Founders is amazing, even warm. We basically shot the shit, and by the time we went to sleep, we're questioning if what we saw the first time was even real. The second day up, there was even less eventful. Basically spent the day hiking game trails and trying to find something weird in those woods. That night, however, we did hear some screaming and cackling in the woods. Nothing came at us. Not even a weird smell, just a night full of odd noises. Not even the wildlife near us stopped its regular hum. Whatever these things are, they were still there, but they weren't near us. The following morning, we took game trails out towards where the noises had come from the night before, careful of our surroundings, of course. We hiked probably for a mile or two, going on and off the trails as they allowed us, before coming to a small patch of thinned-out trees. Only thinned because a lot of them had fallen down. Most of them had claw marks on them, bigger than any mountain lion or wildcat that might have found itself lost in northern Michigan. But almost too big for a bear claw too, along with the fact that there were too many claw marks in the bark. Again, we're freaking out because whatever the hell was up here last time, it's clearly still here and clearly still pissed off. Worse yet, we found a spot where it either frequents because the game trails cut off a half mile before we got there, meaning nothing will come near this spot. Or we found a place near where it lives, which is equally bad because now we've left a scent trail between this place and our camp, and we took mostly game trails here, making the trip that much easier for it. It's midday at this point, so we figured we were probably safe to cut away from this area, find a small stream, and wash away as much of our scent as we could and follow a different game trail back to camp. That way at least the smell on the first trail has a chance to get a little stale before nightfall. That way we also left 2 trails, one of which cuts off for it to follow. hopefully keeping it at bay until we're ready to nope out of the woods. Of course, we were not that lucky. About halfway back to the campsite, we noticed for the second time that the woods were far too quiet for 1 in the afternoon, especially this deep in the woods, and the 3 of us were not disturbing the nature enough to make it go quiet. This was the first warning we had last time, so we started walking at a much faster pace, trying to put ground between us and whatever the hell is out there, which seemed for a long time to be working in our favor. The sounds of nature started returning as we got closer to our campsite. As we got to our clearing, though, the sounds all just stopped very abruptly. The last sound I heard was a bird chirping softly as it flew away. The 3 of us immediately set to haphazardly packing and shoving things into the trunk of my car, while also keeping watch on everything around us. The dead silence of the forest was deafening and must have lasted for an hour after we'd packed, and were waiting in the car to see what happened next. It was clear that whatever this thing was, SKINWALKER or not, was just sitting and watching us. Never close enough to be in view, but not far enough away for nature to resume doing its thing. Around for the noise of the forest returned, and we sort of relaxed and settled in the car. I got out to make sure the battery was connected and poured some extra gas in the tank from a gas can we brought with us, because no way in hell are we getting stuck up here. We spent that night uneventfully in the car, which was hot and gross. The car, of course, was only about 30 yards from a dirt road out of here. So we decided that we were going to stay until nightfall the 3rd, see if we can at least wing it again or even kill the damn thing. Why do I do these things to myself? That night, all the usual suspects were there. The forest became dead silent again, this time for another hour before the copper smell singed our noses, then followed by crazed cackling and shrill screams. We were already in my car doors open by this point, weapons pointed towards where we thought the noises were coming from. Because A, my car was too damn nice and we're stupid, but B, also because firing any gun in a space that's small without ear protection renders your sense of hearing useless, and we still needed that sense to survive this. Then to add insult to injury, these things started mocking us. They were mocking us about, or initial fears from the day before about leading them right to camp because of our scent trails, the way we planned to get back while confusing them. Hopefully, they have been close enough the entirety of the last 24 hours, close enough to catch our conversations. I say mocking, but the right word is mimicking. It felt like mocking at the time, though, hearing our voices in the woods, speaking out to us with the same words we had used the day before. The mimicking slowly devolved into less than human sounds, back to cackling and screaming, then into a low growl that wasn't unlike a wolf's, into the screech of pain and terror of a dog, the wail of a brown bear, more cackling. They were doing these imitations for at least 20 minutes before they went dead silent again. Dead silence for what felt like an eternity. We finally got into the car, and while I started the car, we heard the cackle of a hyena. Over and over and over. I threw the car in a drive and never stopped until we hit the other side of the Mackinac Bridge. Again, not as exciting as the first trip we made, because they were actively after us the first time we were up there, but for some reason they seemed apprehensive this time. Or perhaps were circling us more carefully this time. Is it possible even that we found the same ones again? And since we shot at them the first time, they were more wary the second? Whatever they are, you guys had made a few suggestions the first time that were pretty close. They seem smart enough to know when a situation is safe or not. They also seem to remember faces and voices pretty well for Bump in the Night Monsters. Regardless, there will not be a third trip, because we're almost certain a third encounter with these things would leave all or one of us dead without a doubt. Edit. Missed a small but very important detail, because when I wrote this out, I was in a hurry. Second story. Are skinwalkers migrating? If you have ever heard of skinwalkers, you know some of the terrifying stories that come with the name. You also know that there's one rule you should follow. You shouldn't talk about them, or it could attract them. I unfortunately didn't listen to that rule. Being that I moved from southern Utah to East Tennessee, I thought I was safe since they originate from the Navajo tribes located in Utah. I could be wrong, but that is what I believed. If you don't know much history about skinwalkers, I highly recommend researching them on your own due to the fact I don't know how much longer I will survive. I live in a pretty rural part of East Tennessee. There are maybe 200 people in a 30-mile radius of me, which means there aren't many indigenous people around either. Where I live is mildly wooded on the property, and the properties next to me are the same, but towards the back, where the property line ends, it's very densely wooded. I don't know if the property owners before me weeded it out that way, but it seems that way. I live alone with an American bulldog mix named Maxine, Max for short. What makes everything even better is I live in a fifth wheel. So you can guess it's small. The slightest wind makes the whole camper rock like a boat. The slightest move makes the camper rock too. My camper has modifications to it, like a deadbolt implemented into the door. It is kind of set up like a studio apartment, just mini. I have a couch and a full-size bed and a kitchen. It's all small but very cozy. Just enough room for me and Max to live together comfortably. My camper is insulated well, so you can't hear anything except loud sounds around you. On the given chance a car passes the property I'm on, you won't hear it. But when the rooster crows in the property just next to me, I can hear it. The crow will just be muffled. Another thing to mention is I work from my camper and don't go many places except my parents or friends if I'm up to driving an hour to see them. Max is my protector. She is friendly until I give her a hand signal. Then she will start to snarl and sit in between my legs. I haven't really seen her act protective or even heard her snarl at anything without my signal until now. Even when a wild fox or skunk comes meandering across my property, she hasn't acted protective. The only way I can explain it is she will escort them off the property. She will stay her distance, but she does in a way escort them off. It's cute in a way. She isn't mean to them, doesn't bark at the wild little creatures, won't lunge or chase them. It's almost like she is protecting them. After 3 years of living here, Max won't venture into the densely wooded area of the forest. She doesn't act scared, but she won't go past the property line unless she is on a leash or in the car. After 3 years of living here, you get accustomed to the wildlife and the sounds they make at night. I would say I'm pretty confident with how well I know the area. Well, that was until now. Around a month ago in August, I was throwing a bonfire for a friend who was going to leave for work-related things, and I don't exactly know how we got into the topic, but we started to talk about spooky, scary things. A friend of mine asked me if I had any spooky folklore to tell, since my friends knew that I lived in southern Utah, and was most likely wanting me to go into mythical creatures and what I knew and if I had any stories. I myself have a very open mind about literally everything. I believe in ghosts and witchcraft. But most of all, if an indigenous person tells me shit, I'm going to believe them, whether or not it's true. Well, I gave in, thinking I was safe, and started to tell them about skinwalkers and then Skinwalker Ranch, and how freaky it was that you can't access it anymore, because the military won't let you go near it for some reason or another. I mostly touched on spooky things about skinwalkers, how they're shapeshifters, and how one stalked my grandmother. I went into the nitty-gritty. I talked about how they can lure you into the woods or desert, and how my grandmother's first herd of cattle were ripped apart and thrown around like chew toys. She lived in northern Utah. I talked about the screams and how they are blood-curdling and like nothing you have heard before. I detailed about how they can shape-shift from one animal to another, and how that animal will sometimes stand up on 2 paws and walk like a human. I also detailed how they are evil, and I made sure to put emphasis on it. All of what I was talking about had my friends in a trance. We were sat around the fire, in a circle, drinking beer, and when I spoke my stories, they all stopped drinking and focused on what I was saying. It was awesome for me because I'm usually the back burner friend. No one really asks what goes on with my life, except horny guys on Tinder looking for a lay, or my parents. The night went on, and one by one my friends went home. Don't worry, I made sure they were sober and had a bite to eat before giving their keys back. Slowly it became only me and one of my close friends. She leaned in to ask me if everything I said was true, and I did tell her I believed in it, but it's an old tale from my grandmother and Navajo tribes. After another hour of us shitting the bull, she left. and Maxine and I went to bed. Everything was normal after that for about 3 days. Then the weird shit started happening. The morning of the third day after the bonfire, I was taking Max for our normal morning walk when we started approaching the end of the property line. Max started snarling and the hair on her back raised, and she started barking at the tree line. It set me off guard, and I tried giving the signal to Max because I thought it was some drugged-up person walking in the forest. I couldn't get Maxine's attention. I called her by her nickname, then her full name, but nothing was working. She stood her ground barking and snarling at the tree line. That's when I heard a twig snap in the wood line, and Max ran as fast as she could back to our little camper. Like the sane person I am, I didn't investigate. I ran like hell. I didn't want to die. Ironic, right? Once we both got inside, Max seemed restless and paced the camper until I made her lay down and rest a bit. Maybe she was having an off day? After her nap, she seemed back to normal, and nothing else seemed to happen during the day. I had forgotten about the stories I told around the fire 3 days beforehand. So I wrote it off as maybe a bear or wild cat, and it made sense because she hasn't seen one before, but it was still weird of her to act how she did. As the day grew older and the sun was ready to set, I let Max out to go and do her business before I started getting ready to settle into my comfy bed and read. Max came back and laid down on her couch, and we got settled. I must have fallen asleep reading because I woke up to my book laying on my chest. I highly recommend The Summer of '69 BTW and a blood-curdling scream. Max was up on her couch on all fours, staring dead at the door to the camper, growling and snarling. I quickly got up and locked the camper door. I guess I forgot to before I fell asleep, and lifted up my bed to grab a .22 pistol I kept underneath just in case. I called Max to sleep on the bed with me. I'm not going to lie, I was scared. No, not scared, petrified. Max was alert next to me as the screams went on through the night. The screams finally stopped around 4 in the morning, and I fell asleep clutching the gun. Yes, the safety was on, and there wasn't anything in the chamber, in my right hand and my left hand on Max. I slept until the late morning. I woke up around 11, with Max seemed to have fallen asleep half laying on me, facing the front of the camper. I woke Max up to take her to go to the bathroom and to walk around and play a little, and it was like she was back to normal completely. But today we didn't go back to the property line. We stayed closer to the camper and worked and played and listened to nature's music. The day went by normal. At night, it was back with the screaming. This went on for a couple weeks, and me and Max got used to it. Still wary, but used to the screams. Until one night came along where things got even more terrifying. It was about 2.5 weeks after the blood-curdling scream started. When they started, the screams weren't close by us. They were by the property line in the back, by the dense woods. Well, they seemed to be getting closer this night, probably more towards the middle of the back property, and there were 2 creatures letting out these horrific screams. By this point, I still haven't remembered the Skinwalker stories I told the night of the bonfire. Either way, I was still terrified. But again, I got used to the screams and fell asleep with Max by my side. When me and Max got up the next morning, it was around 9 in the morning. We went outside, and it looked as if a tornado went through. My picnic table was flipped over, the fire pit had been thrown 50 feet to the right, and dead animals ripped and tore to pieces were left absolutely everywhere. And that's when it hit me, you aren't supposed to speak of skinwalkers, or it could attract them. But I was in East Tennessee, not Utah or the surrounding states. So how could it be a skinwalker? Me and Max took the 20 minutes walk to my nearest neighbor, who I rarely talk to. I had Max on a leash, and as we were coming up onto the small cabin the lady lived in, I noticed dead animals all over her yard too. I knocked on the door, and she warily opened it with gun in hand. Now, this lady isn't violent or mean in any way. She is actually rather nice. As she opened the door, she saw it was me through the screen door also in place, and set her gun down. Hey, Max, and I just came over to see how you were doing. Oh, hey, Sarah. I'm doing okay. She had trailed off. So, weird shit has been happening on my property, and I was just wondering if you have heard screams or anything else at night. I noticed that you have wild animal carcasses littered all over your yard. Yeah. In fact, my dogs went missing a couple days ago, and I dash. She was cut off by something slamming down next to the house. Her house had trees surrounding her house and littered across her property mildly like mine until you hit the property line. Her property was about 2 acres wider than mine on each side, but the densely wooded forest started where mine had started. She grabbed the gun from arm's length of her and ran past me to the side of the house. I followed her, and Max went in front of me with her hair up, but not barking or snarling. When I reached my neighbor, she was crouched down and sobbing. Max and I walked closer, and it came into view that 2 dogs have hit the ground from above. I won't go into detail about them, but it was gruesome. Something had dropped them from the trees, which is weird because skinwalkers don't normally come out during the day, or so I thought. My neighbor quickly stopped crying and ushered us to her truck. She clearly didn't want my company anymore, but I don't blame her. She was going to drive us back home. It took maybe 3 minutes to get from her place to mine. She dropped Max and I off. I thanked her, shut the door, and my neighbor quickly sped off. It was safe to say me and Max spent the rest of the day inside with the door deadbolt. I heard weird sounds from outside, but I didn't dare to investigate. That night, for the first time in a while, was quiet, and for a brief moment, I thought I was safe, that life could go back to normal. The next 2 nights lead me to where I'm at now, telling this story in hopes that someone can tell me what to do. On the first night, after the normal night, shit went haywire. Me and Max had fallen asleep around 9 p.m. after a fairly normal day of cleaning my property and getting it back to normal. We were awoken by a god-awful scream and twice as bad stench that seemed to be right outside my camper. I knew I had the door deadbolt shut, so I wasn't worried until my camper started shaking like someone was trying to tip it over. This went on for what seemed like forever until I heard 2 gunshots from the left. Whatever this thing was got hit and screamed a scream I have never in my life heard before. That's when the laughing started. Whatever this thing was started laughing. Like I said before, I don't know much about skinwalkers, so I didn't know they could laugh. The laughing started to go further away in the direction of where the gun went off, and then the rest of the night was quiet. Too quiet. The silence was so deafening, it freaked me out even more. The night crept on, and still I didn't hear anything. I started drifting off into sleep when I started to hear banging on my camper door. The banging shook the entire camper. Then I heard screaming, "Help me! Please let me in! They're coming! Please, Sarah, hurry, let me in!" The voice seemed to be my neighbor, but off. I couldn't explain it. On one hand, it sounded like her, but on the other, it had a slightly off dialect as hers. She had a deep twang to her voice, since she grew up in East Tennessee her whole life. But this voice, almost like it was trying to mimic her voice. The stench came wafting in through the AC vents just in time, right as I was about to unlock and open the door. I stood frozen in my tracks. The voice then warped to be my father's voice, pleading for help, but I knew I couldn't open that door, or it would mean certain death. Then came the other voice, my mother, from the second creature. But again, like my neighbor, the dialect was slightly off, but they were crying for help. Underneath my full-size bed was a huge storage compartment. It was accessible by a sliding door by the base of the bed. I had it built from metal to fit in the camper, also to use it as a bed frame, but I only kept one gun, my pistol, underneath in case I needed to hide in there for some reason. Well, this was just that reason. I slid open the door and climbed inside and called Max to come in with me. Then I shut the door. Everything became muffled at that point. The voices switched between my siblings to my parents, to my neighbor, but since I wasn't willing to come out, this seemed to piss these creatures off even more. I hid under the bed and shook until morning when I heard police knock. I was worried to come out from my metal shelter, but I did and opened the door. "Hello, is this Sarah?" Bleeping out my last name for protection. "S house." One police officer initiated. "Hello, yes, I'm Sarah. Is something wrong? We just wanted to ask some questions about your neighbor." Bleep for her protection. "Did you witness any grizzly bear or wildcats on your property lately? Maybe even a person? Well, not a bear or wildcat, but some weird stuff has been going on around here lately." And I told the officers about everything that had happened in the past month up until that point. Of course, I knew nothing was going to come of it, because the police force don't go looking into mythical creatures, but they did take my statement and left. But before they did, I told them if they needed to get in contact with me, to go to my parents' address. That's when they told me it was a good idea to leave, because my neighbor had been brutally murdered and ripped apart by something or someone. It was her who shot at the creatures. At that point, I was done. I was ready to pack up and leave. So I started to pack everything up, and I called my parents to let them know I was moving onto their property. My dad asked if I needed help, and I obliged. And he said he would be there within the hour to help me load up my camper onto my truck, which I have only done a handful of times. Then I called my place of employment and apologized for the late reports and let them know I would get back to work tomorrow, that I was having some trouble with getting them uploaded. I was only halfway through packing my shit when my dad arrived. He didn't ask any questions, but did in fact help me pack and secure the inside of my camper down, so when traveling my stuff wouldn't fly all over the place. He noticed that all of my outdoor items have been completely trashed and pushed them to the side and out of the way, which I thanked him for, since there was no way in hell I was taking them with me, especially after what I heard from the police. We finally finished packing and hooking up my fifth-wheel camper to my truck in the late afternoon, around 5 p.m. I loaded up Max, and my dad led the way. I finally felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. I finally felt like I was safe. Maybe whatever is there will stay there. My dad didn't ask me what was wrong. He just knew. And like any good father, he helped me get packed and ready to move back home. Even though I was still going to live in my fifth wheel with Max, I felt safe. As I was driving, I felt happy again, not so terrified of whatever was going on behind me. I was singing and dancing and giving Max all the love and appraisal she deserved for helping me get through it all. As all this happiness appeared, I quickly went. I looked over into the woods, and two creatures were running alongside my truck in the wood line. The way back to my parents' house was through back roads in the county, which means they were long, curvy, heavily wooded, and more than one creek winding through them. Most of the creeks didn't have guardrails, since the roads weren't used as much as they would be in a city or town. The roads were easy to navigate in the day, but since the sun was setting quickly, I knew we had to get to the house as quickly as possible. I tried everything to distract myself from the creatures running beside my truck. I looked over at Max, and she was sound asleep, not even noticing them. Somehow, I couldn't keep my eyes off of them. I tried as hard as I could to focus on the road and my surroundings. I tried to focus on how pretty the leaves looked during the fall. I thought of my family and friends. I thought of all my wonderful co-workers who did on occasion call or send me flowers for being good at my job. I looked at all the streams and creeks I was passing and admiring how beautiful they looked. I listened to the radio, playing all my favorite oldies, and sang along to them. Still, my eyes drifted. They weren't slowing down. They didn't seem tired. These creatures were still weaving in and out of the tree line, staring me down. I couldn't quite look at them long enough to figure out what they were, but they were some sort of dog-like creature. Yet, as I was driving, they seemed to be quiet. They didn't scream or do weird noises like I heard the night before. They almost seemed to be waiting for something. The sun was setting even faster. It was slowly getting darker and darker. Luckily, I had amazing headlights to light up the road in front of my pretty well. But still, the part of the county we were in had a two-lane road that was small. Only one yellow line distinguished which side of the road you were on. Since I had a heavy-duty truck, I had to ride in the middle, so I wouldn't send my truck nor my camper into the ditch. I continued to drive behind my dad, occasionally looking to see how far ahead he was. He didn't travel faster than the speed limit, but this time he was 30 yards ahead of me. I sped up to keep close behind. I was slowly catching up when we passed over one of the deeper creeks. Bam! Splash! Something had hit the side of my truck hard enough to flip it off the road. I must have been unconscious for hours. When I came to, I woke up with someone flashing a light in my eyes. I could see their mouths moving, but all I could hear was a deep ringing. Everything seemed fuzzy, and I drifted between conscious and unconsciousness. The last thing I remember was getting loaded onto the ambulance and seeing my truck and camper in literary pieces. I couldn't see the Max at first, but when I did, I noticed she was 10 feet up into a tree and shredded to pieces. I don't remember much, but I do remember I had been transported to a hospital near a decent-sized city, and I had been in a coma for only a couple days when I finally woke up. I woke up in the middle of the night when a nurse came to check on me. When she opened the door and saw I was awake, she ran out in a panic. It must have been a good 10 minutes when she and a man came walking in. "Hey, you're going to be fine. I see you have woken up. Do you know where you are?" The man said. I couldn't talk. I had a fucking piece of plastic shoved down my throat. When I noticed it, I started gagging and coughing. The nurse quickly grabbed something and shoved it into my fore, and I was out like a light again. For what my parents told me, I had to be put into a coma for 3 weeks to let my body heal from the accident. I eventually woke up, healed and ready to get up and go. But alas, I still had to stay for a week to let my body adjust. I don't really know. Eventually, I did get to go home to my parents. I had no truck, I had no camp trailer, and I had no Max. I still remember the shape her body was in, and I don't think anyone but me noticed. I spent most of my first day home mourning the loss of Max. I missed her so much, she didn't deserve this. I felt like all of this was my fault, and essentially it was. That night the noises started back up, the screams, the different voices, everything. I was pissed. What could they possibly want? They killed my dog, ruined my truck and camper, and put me in a coma for weeks on end. I got up and wobbled outside. "Shut up! Go away!" I screamed everything I possibly could to get them to go away. I walked out further into my parents' yard to confront these senile creatures. That's when I noticed they didn't look like dogs or coyotes or wolves. They kind of did, but not fully. The back end of them was the body of a dog, but the front was humanism, and the head of the creature was big, fluffy, and misshapen. There were at least 20 of these creatures. I quickly turned on my heel and went back inside. I could tell they were running right for me, but I couldn't run. I was still hurt. I accepted the fact that I could possibly get killed, and I was fine with it. I wasn't with anyone, and my parents have multiple children. I reached the door, quickly ran and shut it, and locked it all in time. I could hear the creatures throw their bodies against the house, and it felt like a never-ending earthquake shook the house to its core. I could feel them breathe. My parents came running down the stairs and grabbed me, rushing me down to the basement as the back door splintered into pieces, letting more and more of the evil creatures in. My dad deadbolt and hit a little red button in the basement. The sound of screeching metal filled my ears as a metal box surrounded the room. "Why haven't you ever told me of this?" I asked. "I built it just in case," my dad replied. And with that reply, he went cold. That's when I knew this has happened before. To Grandma, and as far as I know to me. I turned to my mother and I asked her, "What happened?" She looked at me and sighed. She knew exactly what I meant when I asked her question, which sent her into a story I have never even imagined. Back in the day, when Grandma was a young teenager, her parents lived here in Tennessee. She dated a young Shawnee boy. She loved this boy to pieces. They spent every waking moment attached at the hip. Well, her daddy didn't like him too much. He thought it was unethical, fucking racist bastard, and decided to, well, take care of the problem. Since then, the Shawnee tribe has cursed any land our family was touched. That's why she died when you were young. Different creatures of the day or night stalk us, waiting for the moment to kill us. And you called upon one of the night creatures, and now they're here, Dash. I could hear furniture being ripped to pieces and the house torn apart. My heart pounded out of my chest. I was angry. I was depressed knowing what my mom was going to say next. They're here because you called them upon us again. We lived in the shadows. Until now. She stopped and turned away. I could tell that she was angry and frustrated. I felt my heart sink to my stomach. I did this. This was all my fault. It had felt like we had been in this metal imprisonment for weeks. We had enough food and only one single flashlight. We had buckets with lids for hours. You know the business. We slept on the floor in sleeping bags, and for pillows, we used our jackets. It was coyish, a little too cozy. My parents didn't really talk to me, nor I to them. I was subsequently the one who brought this upon us, with the help of my grandmother, of course. Throughout this entirety, we still heard the creatures scream. They had stopped ripping apart our house after a few hours. Unfortunately, they did surround the metal box, or that's what it seemed like. They were waiting for us to come out of hiding. They would quiet down for a couple of hours, then they would scream and try to lure us out of our metal bunker, using the voices of people in our lives. One by one, they cycled through people, from my mother's patients to friends and family members, until all we heard was what seemed like a crowd of people screaming and bawling their eyes out. They did this every single time. Every single time. It was wearing my mom out. At one point, I and Dad had to physically sit on her to get her from pushing the button. Hell, let's be honest, it was wearing us out. They knew how to trigger our emotions. Only a handful of times did I hear Max's disembodied yelp and screams. It infuriated me. My poor baby didn't deserve this bullshit. Every time I heard that yelp, I wanted to push the button and run out to save her, but right before I did, I remembered each time that she was gone. I was going insane. I felt like shit for putting Max into the situation that leads her to her demise. I felt like I had put my family in a death or death situation. My parents wouldn't talk to me if at all, and I was defeated. One what I believed to be a day. Everything was going about as our new normal when I started hearing whimpering. A couple of the creatures started to whimper for a while. Then struck absolute chaos. Sirens and gunshots and what sounded like chanting rang through the metal bunker. It was a bittersweet feeling to hear something other than creatures trying to kill us. At one, and was it just our minds playing tricks on us, or was it real? My parents heard it too. They actually started talking to me and to each other. Then we made up a game plan. When the gunshots and sirens stop and we hear voices, we will hit the button and take the risk of going back into the house. If we die, whatever. If we live, awesome, let's move on with our lives. And we took our places around the bunker and waited. It seemed like hours had passed before the gunshots and sirens stopped ringing. That's when we heard two voices calling out our names. Hesitantly, my dad hit the button, and slowly the mental prison we had been confined to lifted. I could hear the slabs of metal slamming back to their dormant position and light filling up the room like a pleasant ocean. I was the first to walk up and out of the bunker. I walked up the stairs. That's when I saw her. I remembered at that moment, if for any reason that someone couldn't contact me or my parents, they were to call my closest friend Sierra. She was my 3 and final emergency contact on all my forms. Next to her was the cop on the scene at my accident. I walked up with my hands in the air so I wouldn't get shot and killed by the policeman, and my parents followed behind closely. I hugged Sierra before I could notice my parents' house. It was an absolute shambles. A whole wall had been torn off and ripped to pieces. All of the furniture had been turned literally inside out. Holes in the wall, the whole 9 yards. People who I didn't recognize walked around the house chanting something, and the police officer started to speak. I don't remember much of the conversation, but I do remember that the hospital called Sierra to notify her that I hadn't made it to one of my appointments and couldn't get a hold of me. She had informed them that she hadn't been able to get a hold of me either, and then she contacted the authorities. She had driven past my parents' property before the authorities had arrived and smelled the stench that was all too recognizable and called a friend who was a part of the Shawnee tribe. Then it called the authorities to tell them to meet her somewhere close by to explain the situation she had just seen and to give her and them time for the Shawnee tribe to arrive. From there, that's when they saved us. The officer looked at my parents and started to explain that unfortunately with situations like these, we had to go into a protection plan, kind of like the witness protection plan, but different. The indigenous groups of America came up with a protection plan for people who had things like this happen, which meant me and my parents and Sierra had to uproot our lives and move somewhere completely different, change our names and social security numbers, and become completely different people. I looked toward my parents, and they looked so undeniably defeated, but eventually agreed. The officer turned to me and Sierra and asked if I wanted to do the same or risk having my life be taken. I and Sierra agreed. Before I could be whisked into a new life, I asked to go outside and get a breath of fresh air. The officer agreed, and I walked out the back door. This time there weren't any weird creatures smiling back at me viciously. I sat down on the grass in my backyard and looked up to the sky and thanked Max for everything she did for me. I thanked my neighbor and her dogs and all the animals who died in this process. And I apologized to all of them. Then I sat in pure silence, embracing every twitter from the birds, every day of sunlight that grazed my skin, and breathed. From not far, but distant enough, I heard a tiny whimper. I got up, and despite my mind telling me, "How stupid can you fucking be? You almost died just now. Stop walking towards it." I let my body walk towards the bush that it was coming from. I reached underneath to see what it was and to pull it out when I felt something fluffy. Not really surprised, I pulled out the fluffy little creatures from under the bush, and I looked at it and smiled. Hopefully, that's what it is. A small dark fox with markings around its ears and eyes like Max's looked up at me. It was malnourished and needed somewhere warm to be, so I took it and walked inside. The cop looked at me and the fox sling and ushered us to his vehicle without question. Here I am, on this car ride to the station. All I can hope for is peace and protection. I'm going to look after and raise this fox sling as best I can until it's time to be released into the wild. Wish me luck. Third story, SKINWALKER. I won't reveal who I am or much about where I live. And to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened. But I just came to terms with it now, and I have to warn people about what's out there, what they knew, what we don't. Warning, this is a very long read, and some of the content below is very disturbing. But I can't hold back. Here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now we know the trails by heart. By the end of last summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people considered sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in a church. You don't let the American flag touch the ground. You don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway. And since no one else was going, he managed to goad me into going with him. That's another one of my hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he had been there before, though only once. His manipulative ploy had been to get me to come with, so he could show me. He admitted this all in the casual way that friends admit being asses to friends. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9. I remember giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals, and even some Ute didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountainous, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to urinate. I stepped off of the main road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing just past a shallow creek with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me as I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other end, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget, though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, and brush, but suddenly it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in the soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them, symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around, as if they actually had been a perfect brick wall, and something had shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only halfway over. While the forest itself was cool, at least from Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There were no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat. It was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end, and there was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day, and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started getting really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned knowing that we'd be walking these 3 same boring hours back. We took our time eating lunch. As we did, I could swear I heard noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and started the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees, and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed that it was making far too much noise and was doing so far too frequently. I told Mark to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now, even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned back and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as soon as it was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how deer were annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off, or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me, because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time, it was funny. Hey, Buck. Yeah, you. Horny motherfucker, leave us alone. He walked off the road and disappeared down a ridge behind a layer of trees pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. Mark, I called out. No answer. 5 minutes passed. I climbed down the ridge after him. Mark? I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in mind. I wouldn't go far, I knew, because he was smart enough not to go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there were signs of a struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things, too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. Mark, I called out furiously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it had hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. Mark, I murmured, then called out again. Mark! Something heard, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard a rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the foliage and revealed itself. This was the second image burned into my mind. Please, give me a second. I've spent every day for the past few months trying to tell myself this wasn't real. At first, I saw a head, the head of a buck, but it came forward, and I realized that it was 7 feet above the ground. I was staring a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared-looking, even as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not at all like the horns of the average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized. A mess of sharp, bloody points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked, with very human genitalia. Its penis was dripping blood, just like its horns, implying things that I don't want to think of. I remember both its arms and its legs. They started human, but near the bottom, they started distorting and became animalistic. At the ends of its legs were powerful hooves. At the ends of its arms were hands with long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws, Mark's body was being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment, there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then, the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark's body apathetically and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang. Suddenly, it's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction of the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar, something that sounded like a buck and a grizzly bear shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all my life, but it was gaining on me. As I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel one of its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping that I was going the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I may have gotten ahead of it. Somehow, I ran and ran and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore, but I didn't care. I kept running. I had never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon, and I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up at the trail at the point where it went up between 2 mountains and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there, near the beginning of the trail, was the SKINWALKER, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but it stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily and dead to the side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail, and it didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition, floored the car, and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me, though I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in dreams, nightmares. That creature, the SKINWALKER. Somehow, I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite. Because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's raped and mutilated corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle left alone for so long that had been quietly penetrated. Fourth story. So you guys like SKINWALKER stories? I have a quick one for you. I posted one in another thread, but it was so long, I didn't want to hijack the comments section of a good story. I'm dying, Navajo, and boy have I heard a lot of stories growing up on the reservation. While I've never seen anything myself, which I'm grateful for, I have benefited by being around the people who have. There's a different kind of evil that exists in the quiet high deserts and deep sandstone canyons of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, even Colorado in the southern Ute area. I can only describe it as an ancient evil. Now, there are helpful ceremonies, rituals, and traditions that are still practiced to this day. Hell, even a local hospital has an on-duty medicine man. But it seems to be a double-edged sword. One means there's also black magic, which most Ain will not even acknowledge or speak of. We are very superstitious and are heavy with taboos. You will find this with most First Nation people. From Alaska to Argentina, it's just something you don't do in fear that it will get the attention of unwanted spirits or harmful beings. Skinwalkers or Naldlishii are just a few stories that kept me up at night with the covers over my head. Here's a quick one for you guys. A Navajo tribal police officer was driving west on what used to be officially named Highway 666. It was lighty snowing, maybe a quarter inch, which is a lot of snow for home, and he sees an old woman walking on the side of the road. How she got there or where she was going was not apparent because she was so far out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't see her right way, but as he passes, he noticed that she is dressed in traditional clothing, a shawl, dress, moccasins, and her hair in the traditional bun. Not too odd. Many elders still choose to dress traditionally. But why was she out in such cold weather this late at night? Hitchhiking. Maybe he passed her too quickly and now has to turn around. And as he makes a U-turn, he notices she is nowhere to be seen. This is fairly flat terrain, and he for sure seen an old woman walking. He pulls the squad car over and steps out with his flashlight. Confused, he manages to find the woman's footprints in the shallow snow. He follows the footprints until they suddenly turn into what look like dog footprints leading away from the road in a hurry. He immediately jumps back into the squad car and meets up with another officer near his patrol. He is a little shaken up but asks the other officer if he has ever seen anything like that. The officer tells him that he has. He also explains that sometimes it's an old woman, sometimes a very beautiful young girl, but always on that road and always in the snow, waiting for the right Good Samaritan to let her into their car. I still get nervous driving those wide, open spaces at night. I keep my eyes strictly on the road and turn my music up high. I rarely pick up hitchhikers, but I never pick them up at night. Fifth story. Don't visit the Appalachians. I don't like to use the term skinwalker to describe the hellspawn that wander the Appalachian Mountains. I say this because the only people that believe in skinwalkers are the ones who have actually seen them. I sure as hell didn't believe in any such thing until about 2 weeks ago. The Appalachian Mountains had always been a place that I wanted to visit. The pictures on Google were enough for me. The place is beautiful. I had heard a few stories about skinwalkers roaming around the mountains during the night, which just made it all the more interesting. So I saved up some money, rented a cabin, and flew out here to experience the mountain lifestyle for a couple of weeks. The first few days were completely normal. I had gotten settled in and felt completely fine. Hiking some surrounding trails is all that I can recall for the first 3 or 4 days. It was on that 5th day that everything began going to shit. The cabin that I had rented had 2 big floodlights facing the backyard. Every night a coyote would walk past my cabin, causing the lights to turn on. I thought nothing of it. It was honestly kind of cute. On the 5th night of my stay, I was sitting in the living room watching some satellite TV. In the corner of my eye, I saw the floodlights flick on. I jumped up to go see my new coyote friend through the window. Let's just say that whatever caused my floodlights to turn on that night was not a coyote. Its body looked completely normal except for the legs. The legs were extremely long and skinny, probably 3 times longer than any normal coyote. The thing just stared at me. My fight or flight didn't kick in. All I could do was stare back into its empty eyes. This creature then let out the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard, then got even closer to the window. I turned around to grab my phone so I could call the police. As I was walking to the couch, the floodlights turned off. The soft glow of the old TV screen was the only thing lighting the living room. I grabbed my phone and sprinted upstairs to my room. My first instinct was to hide in the closet, so I did just that. The closet doors had little slits in them, so I could kind of see what was going on outside. I picked up my phone and tried to call the police. There was one slight problem, though. My phone was dead. It was around this point that I heard knocking coming from my front door. The knocking continued for what felt like an hour. I literally had no idea what to do, so I just sat there, hoping that it would stop. It eventually did stop, but shortly after, I heard the door open. No kicking the door in or anything, it just opened. I started to cry. I could hear faint footsteps getting louder and faster as it went up the stairs. It eventually got to my room, where I thought I was dead for sure. I could hear it opening drawers and messing with my bedsheets. I peered through one of the slits in the door, but I couldn't really see anything. That was until the creature put its disgusting, rotting face right up against the door. It was breathing so loudly that it was hurting my ears. I pushed myself back into a corner and used one of my jackets to cover me. It was my last option. I don't know how long I sat there, but it felt like an eternity. I eventually peeked out from behind my jacket to see some light coming through the doors. I stood up and looked out. It was daytime. I couldn't hear the creature anymore. I assumed that it got spooked by the sunlight and left. I slowly opened my closet door. It was finally safe. Needless to say, I got out of there, and I'm never going back. I don't want to see a therapist because they won't believe me. They'll think I'm insane. Maybe I'm insane, I don't know. All I know is that whenever the locals of the Appalachian Mountains talk about these things, they aren't lying. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Till the end, subscribe to Horror in Detail for more videos. Drop your suggestions in comment section.